Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Boys Table Podcast. It's episode 40, which is coincidentally the name of an alcoholic beverage. How are you, Mesk?
I'm tired. How about you?
Yeah, it's close to the end of the day for me, so I know you don't need that excuse to be tired per se, but I'll use it.
I must say, it's definitely been a busy day. We got an ice storm coming up. Tomorrow, it's going to start bringing us down to minus 13, minus 15, which is going to be record lows for us here in Canada. We never see temperatures that low, except a couple years ago, we had an ice storm that brought us around like negative 11 or something like that, maybe negative 14 at one point. Coupled with about 30, 40 kilometer mile an hour winds. So not that bad, but it does destroy basically everything it touches because here in Canada, we build stuff out of paper mache. So I had to batten down the hatches, get all the livestock buckled in and try to protect the hoses and stuff so they don't burst and cost us $10,000 of debt. And that was interesting because everything is overgrown. And I sat down. And then I got back up, and then I sat down, and I got back up because I never get a chance to do anything. And now I'm sitting here thinking, what the fuck do I do next?
Well, you record a podcast, of course.
Yes, record a podcast. See, that's like one of the only really consistent things we do. Now, I think you want to... I actually think you made a Dodd. I was halfway between Dad and Todd.
Yes, it has happened to me before. That's why I'm laughing. This is not a new revelation, unfortunately. I have called my own dad Dodd before, so.
Did he give you the look? Like, we need to have a talk, son?
He gave me a look, all right. Listen, this is the same man that sat me in one of my chairs and said, from this point on, you have to be me. And I could not hold my laughter in. So that's what he did. He said that. Like the joining of all possible fucking simulations. You, me, Dad, and he might as well have said Todd at the same time.
So anyways, like I was saying before, I just fucked up everything everywhere. I think you made a dad cast, just judging by the names on this, but obviously you thought there was some more room for exploration into the realm of bisexuality. When I mentioned a couple weeks, months ago, whenever it was, I forget, about things like your scheduling and how the fuck it is you manage to actually get anything done, much less consistently. And then you said discipline, motivation, and scheduling. So there was some back and forth on that. I think we have talked about it on the podcast before at the time. My memory is like really horrible. So I very often just forget stuff. And I'm sure I always repeat myself as a result. But this comes at the apex of a struggle right now where there's a lot of really bad things going on. Motivation is at an all-time low. The lowest it's been since, say, like mid 2017 or something like that. Everything's on fucking fire. And I'm actually, before I was trying to finish not an LP, but a compilation, a run-through of World of Warcraft. So the reason why this is time sensitive is because they're going to do a level crunch in the coming expansion, which is coming sooner than you expected. And I was doing a full playthrough, level 1 to 120 or whatever it was, of select zones and stuff like that. You don't have to do all of them, so I just was doing select zones, analyzing them, assessing them as I go. A level crunch will actually destroy that experience and desync everything. Now, normally, this isn't a problem because leveling is not actually really that difficult in that game at all, and it's quite fast. I've actually passed the slowest point now, which was the 70s and the 60s. But, a problem where, when I'm not motivated, I don't like casting. I don't really like doing too much of anything. I can kind of do podcasts like this, but you can probably notice that I kind of tend to rant a lot and then get really distracted. That's always kind of an issue, but especially when I'm not really actually focused on stuff. For a podcast, I don't think it really matters as much, but when I'm actually trying to do a real recording, it actually tends to be really hard to really get anything done at all. So what I do is I don't record. I just wait until I feel better. The ominous feel better, which pretty much is guaranteed to never actually come. So actually, the last time I did recordings for this World of Warcraft thing, and why it's got me so scared right now, because I think that they're doing a pre-patch next week, this coming week actually, I don't think that has the level crunch in it, but it means they're getting ready to start actually rolling out changes. So it means I need to get, if I'm actually going to do this, I need to get started, right? The last time I recorded was when the previous expansion pre-patch came out, so that was. I think a year and a half or more ago at this point, something around there. I used to do a lot of video work off and on, a lot of like editing and processing and stuff like that. I released a bunch of stuff recently that is half complete because I don't foresee getting back to it because of all the real life stuff that's been going on. And it really like hit me at that point, which was the spark of that rant in the short special bus that, it actually was almost a year since I last did Skyrim recordings. And Warcraft 3. Like, when I look at the time, it's hard for me to even fucking believe it's 2020 right now. Much less that we're actually halfway through fucking January at this point. Like, it seems like time has just kind of, like, evaporated. But it actually has been that long since I really was doing anything. So I've, in large part, considered most of my casting discontinued. But I still want to finish some things like the World of Warcraft stuff. But at the same time, I can't bring myself to do it. And I've never actually been consistent. And this is kind of what really surprises me about you. I mean, there's people that are like you, but, like every single day you've got something going on. You're always doing something. And I know you talked a little bit in the past about, some of the struggles you had with like early projects and stuff like that. And I know that you haven't really been doing consistent streaming for that long, but it's still been quite a long time as far as I'm concerned. And it still has been consistent, even though, you've moved, you've had real life struggles, you've been dealing with finances and all this other stuff, you're working and all these other things. Meanwhile, the only thing I've ever actually been somewhat consistent at doing is D&D. But also a part of the rant was that I tend to have, I do weekly sessions. And what ends up happening is I have a lot of work I need to do. But I usually end up doing the vast majority of it last minute, even though I have lots of free time to do it. So there's absolutely no discipline whatsoever. There was more discipline in certain projects in the past, Retribution's really a big one. That's one I just worked constantly back when I was writing as well in 2009. But those periods are few and far in between. So that brings us to the that hour-long rant or whatever. Sometimes I wake up and I'm feeling really rather miffed about something, and then that's where that comes from. Meanwhile, you kind of just seem to never actually be affected by any of that stuff. You are actually still working on projects even when you're not streaming, and you are streaming in general. I have done streaming, actually. I streamed Dark Souls 3. I did a randomizer run, I streamed that, and I tried to stream Dark Souls 1 randomizer. And I actually find streaming really difficult. And I've been doing videos for, almost 17 years now. And streaming is still just really weird for me. Not that I can do it often anyways because of my bandwidth caps, but it didn't really help the whole process. It actually made my gameplay worse. As hard as this to believe, but you're not affected by it as far as I can know. So you said sometimes the chat kind of hangs you up, but obviously there's a lot of facets to this. There's a lot of individual points in this. I guess we can break down as we go through it. But to me, what you do just sort of seems impossible to even imagine. I cannot imagine living on a schedule. Even things like the D&D schedules, they kind of stress me out. Even things like Crow Watch, which is when I have to take out the garbage early in the morning and watch it because the crows will dismantle it like flying chainsaws. That stresses me out. Knowing that something is coming really stresses me out. Not knowing that something is coming and not knowing when something's going to happen also stresses me out. So really, like, I hate existing around the whole concept of schedules or really like time sensitive stuff in general, which is why the World of Warcraft stuff stresses me out, because, you know, I don't really want to record, but I'm going to have to record if I want to do this. And so I'm trying to decide, do I actually want to do this? And there's like this like 69 3 walls of indecision going on, none of which are really particularly helpful. But you have people like, for example, you, that just can pick up anything you want and just get started without any second guessing or concerns or doubts or whatsoever. I mean, the vast majority of stuff that you have played that I've seen, I would probably never consider touching, even if I was paid a lot of money. There is no way I would play something like fucking Black Mesa. There's no way I would play any of those fucking Warcraft 3 campaigns. You couldn't pay me to play Flame Knives. Like, I would never touch any of that shit. And I have played some really, really bad games. I've played Demon Souls. I've played DMC 5. I've played fucking Last of Us. These games are horrendous. I would sooner play any one of those again, rather than touch like the vast majority of stuff that you've played. Like, but you don't really, like, there's some disgust, obviously, but you don't really seem to like hesitate at the process of actually getting started. So there's so many like things I would try to ask in that regard. Like, well, first I'd ask is, how the fuck do you actually manage to do it? You say there's no real ceremony to getting started. You may, like, for a modding stream, you may write down some small plans or something, kind of like my to-do list that I had that I would check.
Right,
but,
exactly like that.
Nothing in regards to like any kind of real like the getting into motivated or whatever. It's just like you're always ready to go, I guess.
Well, the way that I look at it is, well, basically what happens is, I have just drilled it into my head that I talked about this in the dad call that you referenced. Basically, the gist of that particular log was I have built this idea that, and this habit that I'm always working on something, and it's always live in the morning. And then if there's time, I work on some stuff after the fact when I'm not streaming. Actually, one of the things that I do when I am recording these podcasts even is I find some way to do some stuff that doesn't really require my full attention, but still progresses certain things. Like right now I'm in Photoshop fucking around with masking out some terrain that I've got to convert. And most of the time, though, I'm working on level design for some map that isn't finished that I can polish off and, you know, continue to work on. Like, it could be basic decor. It's like visual stuff that doesn't really require me to fully focus on it. And then obviously I go back and audit it after the fact to make sure that it's good. But I think that in and of itself kind of encapsulates my whole perspective on it, because the worry of quality doesn't really enter into my head because of the nature of the work that I'm doing. It means that I can always come back. It's kind of modular. Obviously, there's some times where I could be doing work that ends up getting scrapped in a sense, where I have to completely redo the asset or completely, you know, rewrite the AI or something. But at the very least, I learned something from that experience. There's a reason why I'm scrapping it, and there's a reason why it's low quality. The reason why I'm scrapping it is low quality, but I can sort of trace it back down to find some value in the experience and some lesson from it, and not make that mistake again. Even if I am doing a quote unquote poor job that particular stream, I'm not that focused or something else is bugging me, or I stream for too little amount of time and I don't really get I don't get to sink my teeth into something because I could only stream for like 3 hours or something, as opposed to the 4 or 5 ones that I'm normally doing. These ways that I can still find value even in a session that would otherwise be considered unproductive or just less productive than the ones that are more typical. And I think that helps a lot. I mean, the counterexample that would potentially apply to your work is actually recording stuff for a compilation would seem to be the best bet for you, because in that sense, you can actually do something similar to the Sonic 06 commentary, which obviously somebody else is commentating it and then you're coming in over in post. If you really feel that strongly about the quality of the commentary in a certain recording not being up to snuff, or you feel that you missed something, or you wanted to pause and point something out like you do in Sonic 06, that would still be possible in the compilation. And you can also rely on certain editing to cut out maybe some chatter. Like, even if you're recording something where you feel like you flubbed a point or you weren't able to do it, you could theoretically, because of the nature of the work, because you're just talking and ranting while you're flying around waiting for grind or something, because of the nature of the compilation stuff, you can actually cut out all of that and move on and just in your head reset and then try to redo the point, try to communicate it again. Or you can cut to something completely unrelated. You might end up having to scrap whatever point you were trying to make in worst case scenario. But it's not like that has to be provided to the audience. Whereas obviously a long form Let's Play involves no content being cut, including like obviously idle time is cut, but that's pretty much the only time, unless there's like some catastrophic issue with the file. But generally speaking, that would probably be like the best corollary, because you're building an edited experience where as much of the work that you're doing in the recording is also reflected in the amount of work you're doing in the editing. Sometimes it's even more work to edit it together than it is to just sit down and rant for a while, or try to make, even if it's like ranting in a positive sense where it's good ranting. Regardless of the quality of the work, you can still rely on the quality of the edits after the fact, and those are not time sensitive, so you can take your time with those. That might be some way that I would try to tackle it. Like if I was in your exact position and I was recording and there's a time sensitive nature to it, that would probably be how I would try to look at it, is just like I look at my streams or my modding. I don't try to make sure that I'm always at my, like I do, it's kind of hard to explain, but I do try to be as on point as possible. Like one of the efforts that I have made is, okay, not only am I going to do this work every day, but I'm going to try to make it meaningful work and meaningful progress. So it's not like doesn't amount to a waste of time. So I do try to be on my game, but in the event that the likely and inevitable event that I do end up having a lower quality session at some point, that doesn't have to be the worst thing in the world. I can still get some value out of it. And I don't really worry too much about the quality going into it or even during it. Like, I guess if I'm noticing that I'm not talking as often about something as I should be, like in the middle of an actual stream of one of these really shitty custom campaigns or Half-Life mods or whatever, at that point I would be like, noticing that maybe I'm, not happy with the quality of the commentary that I'm providing so far, so I can try to turn it around at that point. But short of that, like if I watch back and I realize that the commentary wasn't great, or if I'm looking at the work at the end of the stream that I'm doing for a mod stream and I realize that this isn't my best work, that isn't really the end of the world for that particular thing. There was still justification to doing it. I still made an effort and sat down, and I could at the very least say that I sat down and did work, even if the work wasn't great quality and needs to be redone in some capacity. So I think it's sort of like, it's kind of like a day job in that sense, where if you think of it like, your boss in this case is you, because you're working for yourself in some capacity, but your boss would be more unhappy with you for not showing up to work at all than to show up at work and do a poor job than what you're capable of. So it's actually better to put in the hours, or at least work on something every single day. I think you had a similar comment about your D&D stuff at some point, one of the previous podcasts where I brought that up, is even if I could work 15 minutes on something, that's still better than not putting any time in it at all. And you had some comment about that with your photographic edits for your Photoshop stuff. So I don't know where you come in on that, or I don't know how many questions that answers or brings open, or raises rather, but that's basically my approach. Is I don't worry too much about the quality so much as the quantity, because every time I stream that's an opportunity to do something that is quality, and I worry less about whether or not I actually deliver on that. Like obviously that can be a spot for improvement, but I worry more about just getting that consistency down. And once you have that consistency, once you build the habit to do that, it's a lot easier for you to then say, I'm already doing this. What can I do? What more can I do to improve that quality? Like I've already got the consistency down. I'm already showing up and doing the work at X time or Y number of days out of the week or whatever. And then you can start to look for avenues for improvement.
Well, I think it's important to probably bring up now that one of the big distinctions that we did find between us is that you said you enjoy the work.
Yes.
Whereas I 100% do not.
Well, it's a little bit deeper than that, because I was even talking about this on my stream today. I was talking about how I don't really enjoy doing the menial labor of going through and basically doing data entry for the tiles, like painting pathfinding and height values for the 2D tiles in StarCraft. I don't really enjoy doing that, but it's something that I've made a concession where I already understand this is integral to having a completed product that is completely, like, fully fleshed out, fully realized. having functioning tiles that look good, and maybe I'm a little bit more invested in making them look good than I am actually doing the data entry. But the data entry is what makes them functional. So they need to be looking good, and they need to be functional. And that is such an important part of the game that I can't ignore that, and I can't really do a shitty job of that either. Like, if I'm going to do it at all, I want to do it once and then never again because of the nature of the work.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that helps, I think, is understanding that, yes, it's not the most thrilling thing in the world. In fact, it's quite detestable depending on your mood. And maybe you can try, like, if you have nothing else to do but that, if that's like the only thing left on your to-do list to do, then it becomes a little bit difficult. You don't really have any other out. You can't do something else until you feel like going through that. But I find there's less and less resistance to doing something like that, even something that I admittedly do not enjoy, because I know that it's going to lead to some of the more exciting changes in the game, which is having like really like completely distinct environments and stuff to interact with in that sense, and leveling up the number of the functionality of the tile set, the functionality of the environment, in addition to the aesthetics, like drawing them in and using them in a different way. It unlocks more level design opportunities. I'm really into level design. I really like doing that. And so just being able to have more tools in that sense. I actually had a different dad call, one of the first ones, was talking about how you don't really even think when it comes to like custom artwork or custom game assets, like for units, you can't even really conceive of what a unit does without an asset to represent it because of how visual the game is. Yeah. So it's hard for you to, like, I imagine with D&D it's quite different, although maybe similar in some ways.
It's actually very, very similar for me.
Oh, okay. So, like, yeah, if your unit doesn't look right for what the role actually is, it's really difficult to imagine. And it's also difficult for players to read, I find, as well, if you use an asset that seems out of place, even as a placeholder, for what you're actually trying to do, what the combat role of that unit is, or what the significance of that unit is, like how dangerous the unit is, the threat level. And so you want to pick good placeholder assets, but if you have a concept for a unit and no asset matches it, it's kind of hard. Like, you really are stuck between a rock and a hard place, a Dustin Browder, if you will. And you have to find your way through that maze because there is no real way to do that. And so I find the same thing happens with level design. And so a very small but still important part of level design is putting the tiles into the game and putting, setting them up so that they function properly, and then testing them and going in and out of the tile editor. And as much as I don't like that part, it's still something that I find to be incredibly important. And as a result, I don't really have any, like, I can't make an excuse in my head. I guess it's sort of like an argument comes up, and the argument is, you don't want to do this right now, or this isn't, it comes in many ways. Sometimes you might even think this isn't worth doing, but that's like masking, it's masquerading. It's really just, you don't feel like doing it and you're finding excuses. And I've found a way to shoot down every excuse that comes up, including I don't feel like this right now, because that is more of it isn't even necessarily linked to the work itself. That could be used as an excuse, a get out of jail free card, if you will, a get out of work free card for literally anything. And that's one that you have to tackle, I think, separately. And that's where it's a lot easier to tackle something like that when you've still got willpower left in the day, when maybe it's earlier in the day and you haven't already dealt with a bunch of bullshit or done a bunch of housework or whatever the case may be. It might be easier for you to ignore that particular excuse at that point. Whereas at the end of the day, there's plenty of stuff that I could do with the last 30 minutes of my day before I go to bed that maybe I just want to, play a bot game, a Counter-Strike, or watch some fucking video and then go to bed. And maybe that's what I end up doing. And in that case, leisure time is important, but there is an argument you could be making for me. I could be being more productive at that point, but usually at that point I'm kind of checked out. Whereas at the beginning of the day, I'm all about trying to figure out some way to get stuff done. So again, I really don't know. I am struggling to find a way to put it to words, like my process or like what I think about this stuff mentally, because part of the reason why is I've never really had to consider it and try to explain it to somebody else. So I think it's a good topic in general. At least it's a helpful topic for me, because I think whenever you're forced to explain something in that way, you become... You understand it more yourself as well. So I think it'll be helpful in that sense. And I don't know what you think about any of the stuff that I've said so far, but that's pretty much what I think about when it comes to liking the work or not. Is at the end of the day, it's an integral part of the end result. And if you desire the end result, right, which is presumably why you'd be working on it at all, then you have to find a way to tolerate that grunt work that you really don't like. Certainly because in some ways you wouldn't trust anybody else to do it properly. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to do it at all, presumably, because you're finding these assets already and you have to unfuck them because whoever put them up there didn't do a good job. So it's very similar to finding placeholder assets for RTS games. I find is most of them are fucked up, so I have to unfuck them, and that is, in and of itself is another very grueling aspect of putting together, like assembling a custom unit. Is finding a graphic that isn't already fucked or porting something in a way that it does take some time. And we talked about this in another podcast as well. We were talking about sorting through like thousands of frames of units. Like I had to do that for a dog, and just for a fucking dog, I had to do that. So it's just insane. So it's a similar kind of thing where I really don't appreciate doing that, but I appreciate the results. So I have to find a way to tolerate the action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I start my day, it's usually it takes me usually about 5 or 6 hours to warm up after I wake up. And then I'll get out of bed, and then it'll be usually about 11 or 12, do cat drugs. And then it'll take me usually about 2 or 3 more hours to really start to wake up. And then something like the podcast comes up. And then I start to wind down, and then that's my day. So I don't really get much energy in the day. Usually my best time to work is actually when I'm past the point of checked out. So the best time for me to work and when I can actually focus on stuff and really don't really find motivation, but at least ignore excuses enough is actually when I'm so tired that I really just can't think anymore. So this is actually how I built a lot of projects. So pretty much all of Retribution and Salvation were based off of this, but especially Retribution and a very large chunk of work for Unreal 4 in recent times. And the writing and stuff like that. So what happens is I usually the circus on my head just is too much noise, too much going on, too much thinking, too many I think of it like multi-threading lines of thought. There's too much stuff, too many distractions. Distractions lead to stressors, and then stressors kill everything. And too much worrying about other stuff. So usually what happens is after about it has changed. Since I've gotten older, it accelerates a lot more. I can usually handle about 4 or 5 hours of uptime before I start to really get too tired. So, usually what happens if I force myself to stay up for another 4 or 5 hours, I will kind of start to warp past the point of being tired, where then I sort of get to the point of being too tired to actually give a shit. And at that stage, that's actually when I can work. As long as there isn't too much else going on, if it's the middle of the night or 2 a.m. or something like that, I can actually just do quite a bit of work. I can't do casting. There's not really much point in me trying to do anything in regards to talking at that point. But I can do all the menial work. And I can actually get through it pretty reasonably quickly. Sometimes it's time to stop when you start getting to the point where you're making a lot of mistakes. But I can actually hold on to that point for a long time. When I was younger, I could hold on to that point for about 4 or 5 days. So, as I explained in the channel, the way I did my writing in 2009 and the vast majority of the work for Retribution, such as modeling, was I went in cycles of about 4, 5, 6 days of uptime, sometimes longer. And by uptime, I mean I did not sleep at all. And then I would sleep for about usually a day and a half, sometimes 2 days, sometimes longer. And then I would repeat the cycle. So what would happen is I'd hit that sweet spot. The first and second days were the hardest, but after you pass the second day and go into the third and fourth days, it actually got easier and easier and easier to do this. Once you start getting to the point where you're sleeping and you don't even realize it, that's when you've got to stop. Because now you're reaching the actual physical limits of your body and you're no longer going to be able to actually work anymore. But for me, that limit was actually quite high. So that is actually how I made a lot of my projects, is through these very long, some people would probably consider unhealthy production strings. And it was very, very effective. Very, very effective. That is how you fight the tism. But then I went on prescription drugs, and they had a very, very adverse side effect where they made me super, super, super sleepy. And I wasn't on them for any longer than about a year or so. But that was 2014, and no, not 20. Well, one was 2010. 2014 was bad because of the cat. So I think of 2014 being bad because that's when all the moving stuff started. I could no longer, like 2013 was the last time I was able to really do this. I had to really force myself to do it, but it worked. But 2010 is when I had the drugs, and they fucked up everything. They really did. And then I was told I was immune to stimulants. So I actually only drink coffee for the taste. The caffeine actually does nothing to me. Sometimes it makes me a little tired. It can help me sleep. That's actually about it. And I have about 3, 4, 5 pots of coffee a day. It actually really does nothing for me. If I was actually caffeine free for about 2 or 3 years, the headaches were unbelievable. Recommended by doctors, go back on coffee just to fight headaches. But I really drink it for the taste. So I was on Dexedrine, which is like Adderall. That does nothing. I was on Wellbutrin, which is supposed to help anxiety. That does nothing. I took Ativan, which is another anti-stressor. That does nothing. And there was Zyprexa, which was an antipsychotic. That does nothing. There was at least 2 or 3 others I was on for some months. And basically, they all had no effect. So what this sort of means is that there's a really big difference in our day, like the way that our brains work, I think. Because you say you get up, you start the day, you're ready to go. And then towards the day, you kind of wind down and that's it. For me, it's the inverse. When I start up, it is the most miserable part of the day, period. I do not want to do anything at all. I actually have to force myself to get up. So once I force myself to get up, usually because I'm nearing the point where I have to give the cat her drugs. If it wasn't for that, I actually just keep sleeping until it's too sore for me to sleep anymore because my back and knees are bad. Sometimes Charlie horse in the palm of my foot will force me up earlier. Or if I accidentally slept on my face, that's very painful and very bad. I have a lot of problems with bruxism as well, a lot of clenching of teeth. Unfortunately, not biting the pillow, but biting your teeth. And that causes tension migraines. If I've got a tension migraine, yeah, there's going to be no sleeping for a couple of days. So usually I get up because I don't want to, basically. So it's usually about 3 or 4 hours before I'm really able to sit down and really start thinking about doing stuff. And that's when D&D comes up. What keeps me going with D&D is mostly a sense of obligation to the players. It's not really something for myself because I'm the GM. And it's mostly that obligation to the players. I have that sort of sense of honor where, I said I would do something, so I'm going to do something. And that was to a specific group of people, so it has a much more heavy load than, say, for example, videos, which, a couple of these people watch the videos, but the videos are mostly for people that I don't know. I don't hold any accountability towards. But actually, the more accountability I feel for videos, the less likely I am to feel motivated to do them. So one of the things that kind of bothered me a lot in recent times is that I know that my player skill is not very high because I actually don't play games. If I am not recording something, I am actually never playing a game at all. I don't play games. And what that means is that because of the incredibly inconsistent and increasingly difficult conditions for recording has meant that my already questionable player skill has actually continued to decrease since I started recording way back for public audiences back in like 2009. And people have noticed. So usually what has happened as a result is I actually started to think of conscious decisions about, what I would do, what people would perceive that I would do during recording. And that was one of the reasons why I stopped recording, is because I realized, I have accidentally penetrated the casting environment with connotations about a non-existent third party, because now suddenly I'm worried about something that's not even within the scope of the recording or the game. And at that point, that was considered like one of the most awful, toxic things that had actually happened to my casting in general. So that was one of the reasons I stopped. That's just one of like a myriad of things, but it's definitely like one of the conscious things where I view the very process of making stuff very differently than I think the vast majority of people do. The vast majority of people are really set on being popular. They're really set on fame and fortune. And when they try to make stuff, they see themselves becoming popular. And if they don't become popular, they get bummed out by it. I see it as the opposite. So to actually somehow enter a mindset where I actually became conscious of what people might think of me because I don't play games well, that was like I need to stop. like say for example, if Jay Barrino thought that, they'd probably just self-implode, because now suddenly they have to be conscious about every single thing they do. But obviously he's not, and that's generally the way to be, is to not actually be conscious about anything. Just not be like Jay Barrino and be an asshole in the process. But at my stage, it was like I was trying to make game decisions based on what I thought people might actually perceive, and that was not good. So at that point, I started to realize that maybe I'm just not actually fit for casting at all anymore, and maybe I should just stop while I'm behind. And yeah, like you said, it's hard to really put a lot of stuff into words, which is why it can be really, really hard to really analyze, because this is something I've been thinking about for a really, really, really long time, like a really, really long time. So earlier at the beginning of 2019, I had to say 2019 now because it's 2020, and that's still really that baffles the fuck out of me, because it still feels like it's beginning of 2019. Because at the beginning of 2019, I said, I'm going to remove a priorities list. Delicious. So in your case, that would be Manifest Todd or something equivalent. No, I guess you don't list a list anymore. Oh, yes, you do. Future custom content, future game streams. So that was my equivalent. Mine said, okay, I was going to do this or this or this. So that was actually really bad for me. That I had concluded that is actually one of the reasons why I was not doing anything at all. Because what would happen is sometimes, like, most of my recordings are spur of the moment. Like Warcraft 3, for example, I had always planned to do Warcraft 3, but it wasn't scheduled. And one day, for some reason, I made the awful, fateful decision of let's play Warcraft 3. A decision I would come to regret, but it did result in a completed project fairly quickly. And that's despite technical problems I ran into. And that's how a lot of my stuff has been. New Doom 2016, that is also a spontaneous recording. Danny's Inferno, that was a spontaneous recording. Space Marine, that was a spontaneous recording. DMC5 is a spontaneous recording. And pretty much all the games I just listed were pretty bad, especially Danny's Inferno and DMC5. Those games were really, 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 really bad. And I still recorded them on the spot in what is basically a record time for me. They were not planned. Planning is actually bad for me, because what would happen is sometimes I would have that little testicle tingle of, I want to record something, but I don't want to record this. But what would happen is I would tell myself, this isn't on my priorities list. I'm doing something again that I didn't say I was going to do, because this is on the list and that has a higher priority, and I should do that because I said I would do that first. And then ultimately what would happen is I would conclude I would just do nothing. So I got nothing done. That has happened at least 2 or 3 dozen times since the inception of that priorities list. So in 2019, I removed that. But I think by then, I was already so hung up on so much other stuff, most of which was unrelated, that it had already kind of polluted the will to cast. I don't know, there's some kind of underlying layer to our approaches that's very hard to put into words, because I feel like that there is a dimension, a layer, if you will, that's underneath the actual actions. That's what I'm trying to reach. I'm trying to reach that inner mental mechanics that lead to certain decisions being made or not decisions being made. Now, you say you never actually think about that stuff, which basically means that you've already found the recipe. You've never actually needed to. And if you never need to think about something because you've constantly found the recipe to success, that's great. I thought I had that way back when I began in 2010 with YouTube and StarCraft 2. And I sort of had that back when I was building the original compilations. But it turned out that was wrong. It turned out that was wrong, because through the process of running through it over and over and over again, I very quickly lost interest. So my next question to you is, have you ever experienced burnout? And if you have, especially within this particular spectrum of content, how did you deal with it?
Well, a big thing is diversifying the content that you're actually working on. That was one of the things that you had in the bus. You had mentioned that as a potential. Before I had even gotten a chance to respond, because I think I was working during that time, so I was typing between orders. But the that was one of the things that you had recommend or had assumed or put forth as like a potential. Is it just because you work on a bunch of different stuff? That is really big. I remember I had realized that this is well before I started doing any mod streams, really before I had started streaming anything associated with the YouTube channel that I run, which is basically the biggest repository for my content, because I still haven't figured out how to, what other place I can put them on. But ultimately, it was a lot of, working on anything whenever I could. And it didn't really matter what it was, sort of like what you were talking about with if you remove the priority list, you feel like you want to get something done. Then without the priority list, you don't really need to get a specific thing done. You can just work on anything. And so even if I felt some sort of obligation to work on a StarCraft project, I might instead pivot to working on a video or a Let's Play series or something like that. And so that was a big change when I waxed and waned on whether or not I would want to continue my Let's Plays back in, I think, 2016 and 2017 in particular. And that was obviously only a few years back, but that was a point where I wasn't really sure if I wanted to continue making content and if I wanted to continue, or video content specifically. And I had pretty much always stuck with Brood War content as a thing that I would do. But at some point I was thinking, I made the fallacious assumption that, well, I have this free time and it could be going to Brood War content, but instead I'm spending some of it on video content. So why don't I spend it all on Brood War content? And the experiment bore out that I would actually not use that time for Brood War content if I didn't feel like working on Brood War content, which is basically burnout as far as I understand it. Is you just no longer feel like channeling that time and effort into a particular thing. You're burnt out on it. And so defeating burnout was a way where sometimes I would even experiment and deliberately pivot away from something that I was motivated to work on at the time and say, well, I am motivated to work on this, but I also haven't worked on, a video for a while. So instead of working on this Brood War project, I'm actually going to force myself to work on a video and try to make the most out of that experience. See if I can make a really good video with this energy and motivation that I have for something else. And then if my sort of my hypothesis was correct, I would then come back to the Brood War project even more motivated than before, and perhaps like chain a whole week together of productivity, during which I would be able to get a lot of stuff done. Because it's almost like edging. You just you end up with a much bigger load at the end, and so that was basically what I was doing in the form of motivation. But that wasn't really I wasn't necessarily a consistent trick. Eventually, I found out that there was no real trick to being consistent beyond just making the decision to do the work. Because I think that a lot of the stuff that I was experiencing back in 2017, and especially before then, in the years leading up to, I would say 2017 was kind of the year that everything changed, in addition to releasing my first campaign literally my first campaign despite working with this game since it came out in that year. I was also very depressed for most of my life. And 2017 was when I started to turn that around. I lost a whole lot of weight and attempted to, I don't know, it was just this sense of hope that I hadn't really felt for a while, that like shit could actually get better. And I could, this is obviously speaking broadly, not specific to content. And, obviously for one of the first things I cited was a health improvement that is obviously, it doesn't really have any intrinsic connection to working on content. But I found out that it did. I found out that, I was listening to a lot of fucking Joe Rogan podcasts of all things. And one of the things that was talked about a lot on there was basically something to the effect of your mind and your body are much more immediately connected. And a lot of the decisions that you make are actually done through your for one, any active, like, conscious decision is usually done through your, like, ego or something like that, on a psychological sense. But a lot of your decisions that you're not really that conscious of are usually made by your body. Like, your body is telling you that you have to go to the bathroom, or you got to go get some more coffee, or you got to make some buns. And whatever the case may be, you usually go down those actions without really considering them that much, or without being that conscious of what you're doing. And that's not really necessarily a bad thing, but realizing that is a nice way to tie it all together, where your decision making and even your mood is directly affected by what your body is experiencing. That was one of the things that helped me turn that around, because just thinking about that, I find that in general, this is actually like a constant, is I'm actually like a really stupid, smart person in that I think very logically with the tools that I have available, but it took me a really long time to figure out that I should go look for more tools before, like in that logical sense, where I really didn't have any, I guess wisdom would probably be the right term for this, is I didn't have enough wisdom to think about what I was actually working with. But if you gave me tools, I would be able to use them well. And so if like basically people had to, I had to be exposed to these ideas in some way or another in order to actually use whatever ideas that were there to my advantage. I couldn't really come up with them on my own, even with a lot of introspection, until way later when I realized that, you know, I started to recognize when a specific tool set that I was using was returning not usable results, basically unusable results. And at that point I could say like, all right, well, the problem isn't something intrinsic to me necessarily or whatever. Like if I was trying to solve a problem that I was having, a character defect or a lack of motivation or anything, and I wasn't able to resolve it with the way that I was thinking about it, I realized that now I can realize fairly trivially, I need to think about this in a different way than what I was using conventionally. But before 2017, I really didn't have any fucking conception of that. And I sort of had I think like a teenager mentality. Like it was born of me being a teenager at some point where I just figured I had figured everything out, which is obviously a psychotic thing to think. But I didn't really think about that actively or critically until around then. And so when I was talking earlier in this podcast about how I didn't really have to think about my discipline or my work ethic and what caused it, it's because I think the reason why it came naturally, if you will, is that I had turned around a bunch of other shit. And the reason, or one of the first things that I invested, the better motivation and energy and more free time and whatever that I invested in, like, or that I had gained by turning everything else around and becoming healthier and not being as depressed and generally feeling like there was hope and stuff. I was able to turn all those positive things and invest them directly into work that I wanted to do anyway. And so it was sort of like I had freed, again, going back to like the idea that your mind controls your body and vice versa. Because I had freed parts of my, like a certain part of my body so that I had more willpower and more energy and less, I was obviously less fat. So I was able to move around more. I was just healthier in general. I was able to sleep better. All this stuff that was like on its face has nothing to do with your work. I was able to invest everything that I'd gained from that into the work. And that was what I had been trying to do anyway. So it was like I had been, the best example I can give you, or the best corollary would be like, you're trying to lift weights while your arms are made of fucking rubber and you go and get new arms. Like that was basically what I had done, is I had figured out how to like, or I don't know, like you're running, you're trying to run, but you've got training weights on, and then you take the training weights off and you can run a lot fucking faster. Who would have figured? Like I just didn't notice the training weights for years, literally, until 2017 rolled around and I started to slowly become aware of what a training rate even was in this analogy. It's like that would be like an analogy for you that maybe communicates the point. But that was pretty much it. Like I did really struggle with a lot of this stuff. And since 2017, I have had spouts of burnout here and there, which is when it's like I'm working on the same project day in and day out for a long, long time without anything else to break the monotony. Whereas even now where I'm doing daily projects, I'm often pivoting to a map crap or, in addition to working on that, I'm also working on a video or streaming some gameplay of something or whatever. I'm doing other things in addition to the work. I haven't stopped doing the work, but I'm still, I'm doing other things in addition to it. And that helps me not channel that or not run into the same burnout. So yeah, basically in short, aside from a few points around like Project Hydra or whatever, I haven't really had burnout since 2017 or before. And I think in large part that's due to the fact that I was able to take those training weights off, like I mentioned.
Are you saying you crow-pilled yourself?
Actually, it's funny because I think becoming a crow-pilled at a very young age kind of destroyed me for a long time, because it made me realize that like the standards that I was able to make at the time, well, the standards that I was willing to put in a certain amount of effort into making, those standards were, or the standard of quality I was able to meet with that was not sufficient because I had been crow-pilled. So I was like, well, I can't ever do this. Like part of it was actually, I would say I was kind of too cocksure of myself. I was way too like I don't know if egotistical is the right word for it, but before 2017, I had a very, I guess, inaccurate conception of what I was capable of, and I thought that I should be able to make something of a certain caliber without really demonstrating that I could. And so I just had an incorrect assessment of my own skill level and also of my own work ethic. Because in theory, you don't really need to be super skilled at anything that I'm doing. You just need to put in the hours, and eventually you'll become that skilled. And obviously you'll become, you'll have a body of work that leads up to that, and you'll be able to reverse engineer that. And the key is to just keep trying. But I had assumed that I had tried enough and that whatever I do next should be perfect. And obviously that's a fallacy and a half. So I think that is actually directly a result of me having high standards. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of people took everything that I had to say the wrong way is because I was poorly communicating that I was dissatisfied with whatever they had been able to make. And like in terms of custom content reviews or whatever, whenever I would provide people with some feedback, it usually was, I was usually very angry at them for being bad. And that's not really useful for them. Is like, I'm not to say I was abusive in the commentary or whatever. It was more that like you could tell that I was responding in a knee-jerk manner where I was just like, this is fucking stupid. Why would you do this? Like, why? And I would like ask these questions. And so really only people who actually have thick skin, who coincidentally are really the only people I want to be around anyway, would last through those grueling critique videos. But I also think that there's something that you can communicate better without necessarily needing to resort to that. And generally speaking, if you make good points and you're doing so from a point of trying to criticize somebody's work and like in a constructive manner, the same amount of people are going to turn off and never talk to you again and block you or whatever because they're emotionally sensitive man babies. The same amount of people are going to do that then as if you yelled at them for it. And the same amount of people generally are probably also going to stick around. So it really doesn't necessarily matter in a public perception way. So I wanted to dispel any myth about that.
That has been my experience too, honestly.
Yeah. So I would say like, it wasn't necessarily that I was doing a disservice to whoever was listening to the content. It was really just like, I could have communicated the points better so that at the very least, even if they disagreed with whatever I said, they didn't immediately hit a wall where like it's a very easy wall to raise up when you're hearing somebody yell and get angry. And I also think that was related to like depression and a bunch of other shit, like emotional instability in general was related to that, where I would just take my aggression out in some way. It would be cathartic to yell at somebody and tell him how stupid he was to do a certain design decision. And even now I get a little bit of catharsis out of it. Like I can still recognize that if I'm like, usually it's when I'm typing out a message to somebody, furiously typing out a message that says, Blizzard hasn't made a good game since StarCraft, and that was a fucking accident, you idiot, or something like that. Like if I'm typing something that's very obviously contrarian, but also very obviously true, that often still rears its head. But I can still communicate more efficiently now, which I think is a lesson that was just learned over time. So anyway, I kind of lost track of whatever the fuck the question was that I was answering. I know it was about burnout, but I'm pretty sure it has something to do with like avoiding burnout really is about balance. But I think production is about balance. Like producing anything is about balance. And some people don't work enough, and that's their problem. And some people work too much, and that's their problem. A lot of the time I would do the latter, and then I would break, and because of the burnout I would do the former. So I would do a lot of work for a long time, or for a short time I guess, and then no work for a long time, and oscillate back and forth. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit about what you mentioned with your crazy sleep schedule where you would be up for 4 or 5 days. So I had a similar thing where it wouldn't be that extreme. I would still get some sleep, but it would be like 2 hours of sleep or something. And this is mostly because I didn't give a fuck about school at the time. So I was like, whatever, I'm just going to sleep through most of this class, or like not really be awake during these classes. Then I'll come home and, stay up until like 4 a.m. working on a Brood War project or something, or whatever the case may be, whatever I could get away with. And I would usually do that. And not to say my work was any good, but I think one of the things that helped me learn eventually upon retrospection is that's actually like the least disciplined you could be is fucking yourself over in the future, like for the next day, like fucking your sleep schedule over or something, is like because you have to get it done right now. And that sort of swings back over to what I was talking about when I was saying I really feel motivated to work on this Broodor project, but I'm actually going to try to make a video and make a really good video too, and see if I can be motivated to do that. Like somehow promising yourself like you're going to get that work done, and you're making it so that, yes, I know I want to work on this right now when it's convenient, but making it so that you do it on a timetable. Somehow that actually improves your shit long term, like your ability to be productive long term. Your work ethic goes up. So like somehow like actually sleeping helped me more than like it seems like it would just be a byproduct of being healthier with your sleeping pattern, but I think it's deeper than that. It has something to do with you saying, I'm going to exert the willpower to not stay up for a billion hours and work on this project. I'm going to exert the willpower to conserve that energy and go to bed at a reasonable time and then wake up and then see what I can do in the morning or see what I can do whenever I have the chance to work on it again. Because this doesn't fly with whatever the rest of my schedule is for the week. You know, this will fuck me over in some other way. And that was often the case for me. Like now you're talking about like obviously the cat has drugs that you feed them. So imagine it in a situation where like you stay up to work on a D&D thing or to get a cast done or something. Obviously the worst case scenario there is that you sleep through the drugs feeding. And like, even if that would in reality never happen, that would probably be like the worst case scenario is like you miss a feeding session for that. And like in your head, you can probably already imagine like that inner monologue or inner dialogue, I guess, where you're debating whether or not to do that. And more often than not, you would probably decide to just go to bed so that you don't sleep through that. So you don't risk that sort of thing. But it can be way lower stakes too. It can just be like, you're going to wake up later than you have and just going to throw off your sleep schedule for the whole rest of the week. Like that could happen to me anytime where I could, stay up until midnight by accident instead of going to bed around 10. And thus I wake up at 8 instead of 6. And then I have I'm like really rushed to get to the stream in the next hour or something like that. So there's any number of things that could happen as a result that are obviously lower stakes than something like that, but still impact the productivity. So I find actually seeing how strict I can be or seeing how strictly I can retain a schedule, it's almost like another sort of challenge for improvement or something. It's like almost looking at it in the way of like, how good can I make this mod, or how good can I make this level? It's like, how disciplined can I be? How good can I get at being disciplined or sticking to this timetable or something like that? And I experimented with a whole bunch of shit like intermittent fasting and stuff like that, where you'd only eat for like 8 hours a day, and the other 16 hours you wouldn't be eating. So you'd have to eat all your calories for that day in that time. And I experimented with a bunch of shit to see what stuck. And really, at the end of the day, while there's a ton of health benefits to intermittent fasting, it's not something that I could reliably stick to without some more lifestyle changes that I'm still waiting for the right time to do it, I guess, which sort of goes back to something that you said, is like, is it really ever the right time, or am I ever really going to feel better enough to work on something? So same excuse, I guess, for me for that. But there's a lot of ways we could go from here. So I don't know if you have any particular questions for that, or
you want to know how I eat?
Yeah,
it is completely fucking random. There is no logic to it whatsoever. I often go days. I've gone weeks without eating, just because no money. And then sometimes I just eat a lot, and then because there's food, so you gotta eat because you're fucking hungry. So my body doesn't know what the fuck to feel.
Well, it's one of those. What is it called? It's the hunter-gatherer diet.
The goat.
Yeah.
If there's a bush nearby, eat it.
If there's a metal can nearby, you can eat that too. Goats like that.
Yep. If there's a dam nearby, climb it and eat whatever's on top. So I gotta think for a minute, because I forget most of that conversation. I know there was more stuff I was talking about. But
while we're on this topic, I do have to wonder how the fuck Ripcord still does not have a search function.
Yeah, it is. It is so annoying that I can't just jump somewhere. It comes up quite a bit. Yeah, I don't know. Like, obviously, when I was casting before, I was multitasking a bit. When I was working in Retribution, the casting suffered a lot. But I was still casting, and then I stopped working in Retribution because of 2014. And then, because I tunnel vision a lot. Like, I don't have emotional stability of any shape or fashion. I certainly don't have any discipline over actually, like, what I put time into. I mean, I had a character in D&D where I wanted a portrait, and because they need avatars and profiles for them. So I had about 50, 60 images to choose from. But the one I ended up choosing was one that was like a sketch. It was black and white because the facial expression was what I was after. But this is a fucking black and white sketch. And it's not a finished image. So the reason why I chose it is because, well, I don't have the skills to adjust the other images because this too much. But I've been, you could say this is one of those arrogance things where it's like, well, I've been reverse engineering stuff in images for a while. I've gotten better and better and better. Like I showed that image a couple podcasts ago that I did a lot of seemingly small but actually very complicated changes to it. So I thought, well, we're going to try this. We're going to do something really fucking ballsy. And for some reason, taking on that challenge, I did not really hesitate that. I think that's another part of the problem with like general workloads for me is because the vast majority of stuff doesn't actually challenge me whatsoever. Like making videos doesn't really challenge me. I don't really see games as a challenge either. It's just usually just like tedium at the absolute best. And there isn't like a challenge in really like making a cast or anything like that. Like I struggle with words and stuff, but that's that's been a lifelong thing. It's never going to actually change. And but this was something that was like I stood to actually gain from this fairly tangibly, I think. So but it ended up being really inefficient. Like we've talked like be careful with how you spend your time and stuff. Well, I could have taken one of the previous images, made minor adjustments with the color and accent view in probably less than I don't know, 20 seconds, literally. Done the cropping, saved everything, called it a day. I could have been done the whole fucking thing. Even if I wanted to do actual changes in Crider or something like that, it probably would have taken about 5-10 minutes. But I just stuck to it. But instead, I go and say, no, I'm going to edit this other image. It took me at least 2 weeks, off and on, to get that anywhere near a stage where it was looking any good. And then I started doing the basic stuff, like making it transparent. But then I was burned out on it because I'd already done the hard stuff. Now it was just like really the tedious stuff that was left, like your data changes that, it's
Right.
really menial and there's nothing really engaging. It's just you got to do it to actually have the functional end thing. So that took a long time. And then along the way, I ended up, I was trying to replicate, since this was black and white and I colored it, obviously it was still kind of flat. So I was trying to add lighting to it. Like it had some shading, but a lot of the line work and stuff I needed to adjust and fix. The full image still has a lot of problems, but I didn't really care at that stage because I had basically fixed it to the point that the small D&D shaped images were basically ready to go. Even to the point of one of the eyes was black, and I ended up basically redrawing that whole thing and making it kind of edgy. And then I fixed a lot of overlapping lines and stuff like that. But then it came to the colors, so I tried to replicate anime style kind of. The skin has like a glow layer on it, sort of, to represent lighting in some cases, almost like a bloom effect. I was able to actually replicate that in the hair and the skin with a little bit of work. So it was one of those cases where I absolutely did not use my time very well because we're talking about something that's eventually getting resized down to like 160 by 160 and 300 by 500. And then in the browser, it gets downscaled down to 70 by 70. So it's not the best use of my time, but I got the end result that I wanted out of it, so that was good. But at the end of the day, this is probably where like someone like you would probably end up switching to another project or doing another thing. But what I do at that stage is that was last week, so I went and worked on more images. Just different. Like I do my daily is I do a lot of music remixing and editing that's done for D&D. That consumes a lot of time, and then the images, the portraits, and then maps in Unreal that get turned into maps in D&D, and then the stuff for the actual stat blocks. But the vast majority of the time goes into nothing, honestly. So I think previously I would have done video stuff in the meantime, but I don't have I could do that. That's still on the table. I don't have to record something. I can edit something in Vegas or whatever. But I have no actual drive to bother. There's no actual real desire to get into it anymore. So I'm absolutely burned out. I've taken close to a year break off of this stuff, and at this stage, it's starting to feel like maybe there won't be any going back to it, right? So I don't know if I guess from what it sounds like is you haven't really run into that, but I have already run into that quite a bit.
Well, one of the other things that is probably contributing to my success for as long as it has been is exactly the fact that my work does challenge me, but in ways that you might consider, or maybe you just might not consider at all on their face. I went from working on a 161 campaign before Remastered was even announced, so I didn't even know it was coming. That was in Consummate. That was 2017. I had never completed a campaign before, and that was the biggest challenge is, can I complete something? And then I said, yes, I can, and I demonstrated that. And then I said, well, let's do something crazier. I broached the topic of AI. I broached the subject. I started learning it within Consummate. Let's see how far we can take that, and let's see if the remaster is worth anything. And of course, we answered that question very handily with Project Hydra and how fucking destroyed that engine actually was. And then we backported it to 161, and we said our goodbyes to that fucking thing. And along the way, I also worked on the first Nemesis map. So Project Nemesis is a separate project that involves up to 3 players against usually some combination of enemies from the canon. So I took a Omega, the last mission of the entire game, and I flipped it so that Kerrigan was the only AI, and you were up against her and her insane number of tentacles, and you had to deal with that. And you were, one team was the UED, one team was the Dominion, and one team was the Protoss, the same enemies that you fought, but I was just flipping the perspective. I thought that was kind of a novel approach, and I was trying to figure out if I could even make a single AI challenge all 3 players, obviously with a huge amount of cheating and some broken new units that I added in, and a lot of concessions. But the concept was still there to challenge me, is can I even do that? And it was a fairly successful map. Obviously, no longer functional because it was made and remastered. And then I don't think I ever finished backporting it because I started working on a new version, and then I stopped working on that entirely. That was when I was talking about a little bit of burnout. That was back in late 2018, I think, is when I did that, or maybe very, very early 2019. So, that was still challenging in a sense. And then we went from that to working on the new version of Hydra. A couple other small projects along the way had been explored. Basically, I guess it would be akin to recording the first segment of an LP. I would just quickly fuck around with a concept for a campaign that I had for a while, and still believed in, or I would maybe come up with a new one on the spot. And I would, make the first map and start to plan out the tech trees and the AI personalities and the plot and all this other stuff. And so I would get to, varying extents of progress done for those before, putting them on hold. But that was still work that was fairly valuable insofar as it was challenging me to get into a completely different headspace than I had been in. And so there's actually an infinite number of ways that you can be challenged. The question is whether or not you find those ways meaningful. Sort of like some people would probably construe what I do as, in some senses, grind, or closer to grind than an actual challenge, similar to a video game example. So one of the things, for example, is you have to find a way to basically invent novelty, which is usually the source of challenge, is can I even do something I've never done before kind of deal? At least as far as I'm concerned, that is what has driven a lot of my challenges. And so Hydra 2.0 is significantly different from Hydra 1.0, so it's not even really the same kind of project. It's very, very different. The core premise is the same, but it includes a huge number of tech tree changes and basically remakes the game in many ways in terms of the tech trees and the additions that it adds, and completely changing the maps and all this other stuff in ways that I was not doing before. So it is very different. It's a market, departure from the project that it was born of. But then you look at Inconsummate, and the remake for that, while it does involve a lot of new things that I've learned over the years, the remake for that is also one of those things where it is obviously rooted in a little bit more closely in the original project. And so you might even say, how could you possibly be challenged in that beyond whether or not you can assemble yet another campaign, which doesn't seem very, meaningful as far as a challenge goes, because you've already demonstrated that you could do that. Well, there's the obvious, more grind-oriented answer is, can you do it again? And can you do it in this headspace, this design space, this stuff? And really, a lot of the changes that I'm talking about aren't really that minute. A lot of the changes are fairly significant and would involve a very different development cycle for them. And in general, even within a single project, say a single campaign, I could find tons of different things to focus on. Like maybe I want to have the remake of Inconsummate be, have a targeted exploration of what is even possible to do with Zerg AI in particular, because obviously that race behaves very differently than the others, and AI are actually fairly gimped right now in the current AI environment. And finding a way to really explore how you can make them clever and make them work in exciting ways, that could very well be the key to the end of all things for the Zerg. And so you could find something that would impact all future projects in theory on a conceptual level to work on and find fulfillment with when it comes to that sort of thing. So that could be something that you could do. And you could say, well, that's clearly a challenge in a sense. It's not something that you've done before. So you're finding some way to repurpose the existing content and find a challenge in it. But there's also a challenge intrinsic to it. There's a challenge intrinsic to making the remake of Inconsummate is, can I take this product that I've already put together, and can I do so much better that it justifies even making a remake in the first place? And that is an open-ended question that some of the best questions end up being open-ended. The best challenges end up being something that you can't really solve on a theoretical level. You actually set a goal or an expectation, and then you have to try to match that. And that can be something that you can chase until the project is released. And even after that, until the project has been, maybe patched out once or twice, ideally no more than that, because ideally you've stress tested it. And, you've taken a week or so long break from the project after that, from not even looking at it or even playing it. And then you come back and you look at some of the reception and you maybe give it a whole another playthrough yourself and see how you feel about it. That can be when you answer that question. So that could be a very open-ended one. And that can be a very open-ended challenge as a result. And so I think that deserves some exploration on that sense. So I guess the corollary, I'm sure you've maybe already thought of a couple of different things that you could do that would be similar to this in theory on a mechanical level or something on a principle. But a corollary for a Let's Play is you've done plenty of Let's Plays before. The grind-oriented answer that I keep calling it that anyway is, can you do another? But maybe there's something that you could focus on that is pertinent to the subject material of the game that you're casting. Maybe there's something that you could try to do as a challenge to yourself. And it almost seems like kind of a gimmick, like what I was talking about with exploring Zerg AI and doing so in a more targeted way in the remake of Inconsummate. That's not really a current plan, but that was just an example. You look at, maybe you decide to pick up Kingdom Hearts 2 or 3 or whatever your next Kingdom Hearts game is as your next game. You can try to find a way to, like, you could do it something that's kind of mundane, where it could just be like making your voiceovers funnier for when you're reading stupid text, because they don't bother voice acting that shit sometimes. And, you could do something like that. You could make it comedic, but you could also make it like, this will actually be challenging to keep up an act of a certain character. Like I know from experience, because I do that for all of the fucking custom campaigns, because none of them have voice acting. And that can be very difficult to keep up if you're not careful. So that's one of those things that I would recommend in general is, it doesn't have to be that specific example, but finding some way to meaningfully challenge and provide a different end user experience as well. I don't know how often you go back and watch your own content, but sometimes I actually do find that it, at the risk of sounding like I'm huffing my own farts, some of my content is actually very good on repeat viewings, and I myself find a lot of value in going back and listening to that. There's a lot of shit that I forget saying, where that comes into the territory of humor, where you just completely forgot that you said something so outrageous, and it really makes you laugh. But there's also plenty of other things that I think can come out of that is looking back at your own content. You listen to it critically as well, and you can especially for somebody who's been doing it, like you've been doing it way longer than I have. You've been doing this commentary thing a lot longer. I think you could benefit a lot from looking at your content and saying like, well, I have been doing this for a while. How much better can I get? And with no maybe clear goal, but that is another open-ended challenge is, for one, can I improve within the time span of a single cast? But for another, how much more could I be able to do, or would I be able to do? How much better could the commentary be from this last Let's Play the very last Let's Play that I did, or the last Let's Play of this genre that I did, compared to the one that I'm about to do, and tracking that, and like going back to your old content, watching that first, and then giving your new cast a go or something like that. And obviously you said that you don't have a whole lot of time, but and I guess you probably wouldn't be able to like watch those videos in bed because they're on your server. But something like that would potentially, you work out some sort of system where you can watch those in a way where you've already removed from them, because obviously you watch them for verification, but you watch them months or years after you've recorded them and put them up in the public directory, and you try to see what you can come away from when it comes to being critical about that. It's sort of similar to just playing your map after it's complete, or your campaign after it's released, and trying to find ways to improve the formula that you're reverse engineering from obviously making it yourself, but also just memory, going through the whole thing and seeing what the end result was. So another meandering response, but I think that can really help counter burnout, is finding new ways to challenge yourself, maybe even mundane ways to challenge yourself. Can I do it again? Can I do it with this sort of gimmick or something or novelty? Can I do this thing that I've never done before, but that will still result in, at least conceptually, a better end result? Experiment, a lot. I think that helps. I most certainly find a lot of things can be done in ways where you've had an idea for an experiment for a long time, but you don't get a chance to implement it until a spur of the moment drive. You think, well, I do kind of feel like working on something, and then you kind of connect the dots of, well, not only could I record this, but I could also do this experiment that I was thinking about doing a while ago, and maybe that can also help. So, I don't know what you think of all that. You.
Okay, so consistency is like, like with World of Warcraft, I am actually voice acting all the dialogue in that game,
right?
Which is goofy, but like for me, like the hardest part is obviously starting. I think consistency is one really most important thing. It's not just really consistency though. It's also like, I had another word that I was thinking of prior, but the interruption really screwed up my whole train of thought. It isn't just consistency, but it's also fuck, I thought it was another C word. God damn it. Consistency is still important, because that's why I at least try to do something every day with D&D, is because this, like, the working on that thing took me a really long time, but it wasn't something that's a super high priority. So I would come back to it every now and then and work a little bit and then come back. And then for when it helped with reflection, I would do something and then think about it after it came back. And I think, so it took me this long to do X or Y. Is there a faster way I can do it? Say, for example, with colors. And it turned out that the image had been really heavily damaged by JPEG compression, like really, really badly. And initially, the way I handle JPEG compression for a lot of stuff is by using Clone Tool and then like smoothing everything out and then fixing it afterwards. But I discovered with the hair, I can actually just use the Blender Smooth tool right off the bat and never have to use Clone Tool. So I've actually almost used Clone Tool for extremely little in that image period. And the way I would have done the other eye is by Clone Tooling the other one on top of it and then editing it. But I tried to draw an outline, that didn't work. I tried to Clone Tool, it didn't work. I made an overlay and tried to redraw out of that, it didn't work. I had like a whole bunch of like really elaborate ideas in my head, but ultimately the way I did it was just by redrawing the other one, parts of it anyways. It took quite a few tries because I can't draw lines very well, but it did sort of turn out all right. And consistency can be hard though, because like I said, like I don't really like working on the same thing a lot. There are certain interactions that occur as a result of working on something that can push it along. Usually what gives me some kind of motivation is to see stuff finished. Because like I said, I don't enjoy the work at all. So a lot of my projects do tend to be sort of long running. But with videos, it usually tends to be like the verification process. But that usually comes like that. Well, things have changed now. Like I haven't had a long running project since HKS got me the new system. Because before, what would happen with a video recording project is I would record, say, 3 hours. And 3 hours would turn into about 24 hours of encode time, in which you couldn't do anything. So that has been cut down to like 1/10 of what it once was. It's now basically real time or faster encode speed. So a lot would change in that regard. But it's at the stage for me where it's like I don't really want to start. So there isn't really much consistency at all. The only consistency thing I have going on is D&D right now. So one of the fears is that if I do actually manage to start something up again, then I'm going to run into time problems. But that's also not really a problem as much with the system anymore. I mean, it wouldn't really be an issue anyways, because even while encoding, I could still hypothetically do image editing. Before it was an issue because of RAM, actually. You couldn't run Vegas and Unreal 4 at once on 12 gigabytes of RAM. You would just explode everything constantly. And light baking and stuff like that was right out. So it kind of like really forced you to segregate. You could not multitask that much. And okay, Pale Moon, you can do you, man. I don't know, like there's a lot of obvious indecision going on that really doesn't help a lot of stuff. But from what it sounds like with your projects, you kind of like had an original idea and then you kept wanting to improve it. Whereas the only time I think I really ran into that a lot was with Armageddon Onslaught originally, and then with Retribution / Salvation. So Retribution, obviously, that started in Brood War, and then I wanted to do it in StarCraft 2, and it turned out StarCraft 2 doesn't support mods. So that was the end of Armageddon Onslaught, as an entire project concept immediately died, with some, months to years of planning / work and labor behind it at that point. It just dies immediately. The campaign iterations were very different and were all basically just like, attempts to prove a concept. And all those were unilateral failures. Apex sort of falls in that regard, but Apex was never solidified enough to really be considered a real, genuine project. I established that the vast majority of what I wanted to do was possible, except for the scope. Since StarCraft 2 can't handle anything larger than like a 64 by 64 map without the most powerful systems coming to a screeching halt, and AI is just right out in terms of performance. But we had functional AI, we had campaign AI, we had stuff that every single person on Mapster thought was actually impossible. And that was after I'd already demonstrated it to be possible. And we had proved that a lot of graphics related stuff was possible. And then, as a result, I made, Carbot StarCrafts possible. And, Dwarven Combat, in some respects, a lot of the graphics like that came as a result of that research and development. So, but like I said in another podcast, like that stuff doesn't give me fulfillment though. Like to me, it still seems like a waste because it was on my project. So my interactions, I guess, have been really not the same because they have always resulted in something getting discontinued in one shape or fashion. And since I don't enjoy the work, to me, the only way something gets vindicated is if it's actually finished, if it's actually completed. And none of that stuff was completed. The Retribution audiobook was a standalone thing, so that doesn't count. And to me, that was more like a thing I did out of bitterness rather than out of an actual desire to make a project. It was out of bitterness for then the 7 years that had went into Black Sun's overall various attempts and iterations, and 2 months of time went into that audiobook. Actually, I feel like the audiobook would be a relevant thing to talk about in the subject of this podcast and discipline and stuff like that. But unfortunately, since that was in 2014, I actually don't remember very much about it at all. I do remember that I had a routine for my voice acting because I had discovered that voice acting dialogue was actually very difficult. Because previously, most of my voicing was done either in casting and commentary or for stuff like unit responses. And some dialogue I had done for people like Laconius, that was done mostly on the side. It wasn't really like major stuff. Fast forward to Retribution, it was going to be around 3 hours long. And there were fairly complicated passages of words, at least for me as a Canadian. So for all you people living in first world countries, Canada is kind of like the Middle East of America. Canada is basically the 69th state of America, where they sort of shove off all of the various inbred, rejects. And then you have people like me, the native Canadians. We're even worse than the inbred rejects. We are basically the boogeyman that your mom told you about under your bed to keep you, from wandering around in the middle of the night, to make you go to bed at night. We are just maybe like one step detached from the Yeti, the Bigfoot. We are very uneducated, uncultured, and our English tends to be really terrible. We elect our national president for the state by licking windows, and it shows in general speech. It really shows. Voice acting dialogue was really, really, really difficult. Very, 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 very difficult. I slip on words a lot in the podcast and other stuff like that. Actually, voice acting stuff is much harder because I can take pauses while doing stuff like this to sort of like collect my thoughts. You can't do that in a fucking actual recording. And furthermore, I was trying to voice act off of a script, which is actually much, much, much worse than just stream of consciousness for me. So I encountered a lot of stuff I never encountered before in that, and that forced me to really change how I did my work. So normally, when I did a mod, like say for example, if I was making Hydra like a campaign, I might say, for example, what I would probably do today is I'd probably block out all the scripts and then voice act all of them on the spot. And then, unless I knew something was going to change. If something was going to change, then I wouldn't do that. But if it was something that was fairly small scope, like say a dozen missions, or 5 or 6 missions, or something like that, I would voice act all of them on the spot. So, I did this actually for some of the Apex stuff, the early ones, but it was smaller scope. I did it per mission because the voices didn't require much editing. If it's a very simple voice, I will actually voice act it on the fly because to me, having something tangible in shape is much more important than having it like in varying stages of completion, but not tangible. So let's take, for example, that Warcraft 3 thing that I slapped together. That was written out and then voice acted. First, I did the triggers for the dialogue. That was the script. And then I did this stupidly because I'm dumb. I think I transcribed it from triggers back into script and then voice acted it as like for that specific setup. That's what I did. I don't remember why. I think because I was more interested in getting it actually like functional Warcraft 3 rather than really having any actual structure to it. So it was really inefficient. And then I voice acted it. And then I discovered there was pops and crackles because Audition for some reason does that for me. So I actually went into the spectral waveform and I edited almost every single sentence in that has at least 2 or 3 crackles in it. I went into the spectral waveform and manually edited every single one of those out in the spectral waveform by deleting them. So they all had like a kind of a specific appearance. So I knew what I was doing, but it still was at like 2 or 3 hours of manually editing audio for something that was just basically a giant string of racism. So very efficient use of time, but I still cared about the quality at that point. But then I had, triggers with basic camera and then voice dialogue. So now I had an actual tangible representation of what I wanted. There were still a lot of things that could have been done. Like the actual cinematic was just the camera moving around and the prophet teleporting and some other stuff. But there wasn't like a lot of, bells and whistles that should have been in there. Because I didn't have those. I didn't really care at the time. What I wanted was that tangible shape and form. Like this was presentable enough that I can record it. So that's what I wanted. So In Armageddon Onslaught, for example, what I would do is I would quickly put together the iScript for a unit so I can control it and move it around and see the graphic and then get the graphic in the game. So I had a unit in my test map, but now it can walk around and attack, and it has nothing else configured. That's stage 1. That's phase 1. That's like blocking out concepting a unit. And then that tells me how big the unit is, what it actually physically looks like in the game, which is very important because the physical appearances of stuff usually dictates what they do. And that's the case for D&D as well.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier.
Graphics.
Right.
Yeah, I look for graphics, and then the graphics tell me what this looks like it's supposed to do. So, you know, a lot of people in D&D, they just use whatever. They may not even use full body tokens. They, most of the time, won't even use isometric stuff like I do, but I do because I want the visual representation. Because I see the visual reads and stuff like that as being really important because it saves me time in describing something that now you physically can see it on the screen. So it's going to register much more naturally to you. So that means that when I have something like that, I actually try to design the abilities and statistics in a similar way to what it appears. Now, this is obviously very anime styled and stuff like that, so some things get stretched a lot. But typically, if you see something with tentacles or chains, it's probably going to have something related to tentacles or chains and how it attacks you. It may have grapple attacks or reach or something like that. If something is surrounded by fire, it probably has some kind of fire-related attributes. If something is really big and muscular, chances are it has good grapple statistics, and it might try to grapple you as part of an attack. You know, if it's something with a scythe, you can expect some very damage or, you know, high critical chance or other sorts of things. So I try to build stuff on that. And Retribution's audiobook was similar. But the problem I had was that I couldn't actually bull rush it. I couldn't record nonstop. My voice wasn't practiced for long-term casting. This was the end of 2014. We had just come out of the move, and I had been dealing with a cat for the entire year and the end of 2013. So yeah, this cat stuff has actually been going on now for close to 7 years. And it's not going to stop. So I hadn't been doing much. I did some LPs in that year. I think I did Last of Us and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, but I don't remember how close of any of those were to Retribution. Didn't matter because I was out of practice for casting, much less for recording dialogue. So that was one of the few cases I actually forced myself to follow a schedule. And I was very robotic about it. It was not a project of passion. It was something I treated as a job because I wanted to get a project done. Like at that point, I was super conscious and super bitter that Retribution had been died because Killer 11, aka the coach, turned out to be an untrustworthy piece of shit. So, you know, this guy I'd known for years had led me on for a year and a half before I had finally given up. And then this was the end of a 7-year project, and I didn't want to let it go. So I did something very unnatural, and that's I forced myself to make this audiobook because of a suggestion of some unrelated person. And I decided if I find the Vegas project file for, it was like a dry run, kind of like that Warcraft 3 thing where I had done all the voices for a previous version of the script. But I had composited everything in such a way that I could like jump in and edit it without really a lot of work to make a foundation for the new version. I found that, and I said, I'm going to do this. Of course, I ran into problems because this was, like I said, I wasn't ready for this voice acting workload. Because actually what happens is that each paragraph in Blackstone Retribution would take me about 3 or 4 hours to voice act. So I actually ended up spending a monstrous amount of time trying to do the lines because I would trip over words a lot. Or the pacing, when I listened to the pacing, it wasn't quite perfect. This was one of those things where I pursued absolute perfection on. There is 2, maybe 3 instances in that audiobook that I can name off the top of my head that I don't like. And that's because there's so few of them because I would listen to it over and over and over and over. Like there was not a minute in the day I was not working on it, basically. I did not take a break. But I had to take a break from voice acting. Because I was actually destroying and losing my voice very fast. So I also discovered that if you drank or ate different things, even like upwards of 2 hours prior to doing your casting, your voice sounded different. This was relevant because I did the narrator first. Towards the end, it turns out I wanted to redo stuff. This was 2 months later, and my voice was nothing like I could not actually replicate the old voice, just with only 2 months of difference. It was completely different. And that really confused the ever loving fuck out of me. And that is why today I don't do voice acting for people unless they have a full script they know is not going to change because of experiences like that. Because this was a voice that wasn't even edited. And it was that hard to recapture. I did eventually get some sort of like middle ground, but what you don't see in that project is that there is probably about 10 to 20,000 cuts just for one line, one audio channel for one character, where I have taken individual words out of some sentences and used them for others to piece them together because the pacing was a little bit slightly better. And then I would time stuff down to the frame for every single word, every single sound effect, every single music cue. Everything was timed down to the frame. So that's why it took 2 months, is because of how really, 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 really focused I was on that. But as a result, I'm not necessarily happy about the project, but I think it came out acceptably. And more importantly, it was actually finished. So, like, to me, when I think of scheduling, that's what I think of, like, an instance where I was able to make it succeed. But that was only a 3-hour audiobook. Can you imagine trying to do that for a campaign? I would spend 20 years on something, and I would not have the motivation to hang on to it for any more than a couple months at the absolute maximum. Because campaigns are much harder to perfect. The testing process is much longer. So when you're talking about coming back to Hydra and stuff like that, I actually couldn't do that. I would not be able to scrape the motivation to come back to something. Armageddon Onslaught 2 is an entirely new project and a different, what we had hoped was a better engine. It wasn't. And, with better assets and stuff like that, which we did have, but the engine wasn't willing. But it was still effectively like a new project. So that's why I could go from, AO1 to AO2. Hypothetically speaking, there's a good chance that if we'd gotten into it, maybe it wouldn't work. Like, processing and stuff aside, it still would have been a long project to work on. So I think that long projects really bring out people's character the most, how they manage to deal with the challenges that come up with the motivation. Because you'll find that pretty much nobody can do it. Nobody can handle long projects at all. I know one guy who does it, and he does it by taking long breaks and focusing on other stuff and doing other stuff and basically like unwinding out of something and then coming back. He's coming back to his big project after I think like 2 or 3 years of leaving it untouched. And then he like reassesses where he was. He digs up everything all over again. Like he doesn't even look at it until now. And now he looks at it, and now he like basically, goes through testing everything all over again, figuring out where he was, what needed to be done, building his to-do list, and then actually working on it and stuff like that. And even that process can take like a month or two because of the scale of the project. So like, I think that takes a massive amount of discipline that you just will not find in the average person, because the average person will not even last 2 months on a project, much less, I think like 15 years or something like that.
Well, I don't think we're really talking about the average person when we talk about anybody who's making a project to begin with, but I guess you're talking about the average person who would make a project.
Lots of people try to make projects. Lots of people. Like, this is like what we have on say, even your Discord server. That's not really representative of most people, because most people, they're like, I'm going to make a map, I'm going to make a mod. And then they spend like 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and then they're done. That's it. Then the other chunk of them may spend 2 or 3 weeks, and then they're done, and then that's it. And then the 1% will spend 2 or 3 months, and then they're done, and then that's it. The 1% of them will spend 1 or 2 years, and then they're done, and then that's it. The 1% of them will spend 5, 6, 7 years, and then they're done, and that's it. That's it. They're done. No more. And then the tiniest individual fraction of them, to the point that I can count on one hand the amount of people that I know, how what it actually takes to go through a real project, an actual total conversion, and actually polish it out and finish it, and actually like manage their time and stuff well enough to actually finish it and make it of a reasonable quality. And that's the amount of people that I have met on one hand over the course of 20 years since I started publicly associating with people and making projects. Basically, nobody can do it. Nobody can do it. There are people I know who are even more productive than you. They work pretty much all day, and then they manage a job, and then they come back and they work on all day. But they absolutely cannot finish things. They cannot finish things. The only reason they're productive is because they keep jumping from new thing to new thing to new thing. So ultimately, what ends up happening is they're not actually really that productive at all. And then you would ask them about this, and they would say, "Oh, the project isn't discontinued. I'll just get back to it later," or "I don't continue to consider the project dead." But they never do actually return to it, and they never will. You can look at it. I mean, just look at CC. I think that Labyrinth will eventually return to CC. But for something that could have been resolved in just a couple days at the absolute maximum, if you really sat down, put the time into it, and really wanted to get CC done, what you would do is you copy paste my site and you change the colors and maybe the images. And then you would throw up the data as plain fucking text for the campaigns and any other content that you have. And then the download links, and then you're done. You can worry about prettying it as time allows afterwards. But if you really wanted to get this stuff done, that's what you would do. If you really wanted to be lazy about it and really wanted to function over forum, you would do that. But that's not what's happening. That's never what happened. It's just got overcomplicated. And that's the case with a lot of things. Like a lot of people who get into mods, I like to look at things from a big overarching form. Like when I look at D&D and I look at assets and stuff for it, I look at things as a final form and I work towards that because, I don't like the middle ground. But I still want to have something tangible to actually work with so I can actually see my progress being made. So I have actually something I can measure by my efforts by. But at the same time, when a lot of people do that, they do it without actually being able to measure their advancement. For a video project, for me, that's individual segments, right? Like my casting and my editing and stuff like that, it doesn't mean anything until it's encoded and finished and verified. Then, and only then, has anything I have done actually mean anything, because now I have a presentable form that I can upload. But I don't release stuff until it's actually like a whole 8% finished. Now, stuff like the WoW series, I think that was a bad idea to release it individually, because now we're in this spot where it's like, oh, I finished this other work and I no longer feel obligated to justify it because it's already been released, so I really don't care anymore. But now I actually need, to actually kind of complete it, to finish the real goals that I set forth in it. And this is a problem that people face with projects too, is they reach the same stage where they don't really know what to do, so they decide to release a beta test. But they're the kind of people who are really invested into the whole public opinion thing. So usually what happens is they sort of like cave into peer pressure, but they're actually like burning out on motivation on their own. So they decide they're going to release a beta test, they're going to get feedback, and then they expect that to give them the surge of motivation. And I think in every single case I've ever seen, it kills their project.
I haven't seen really too many. My own campaign is probably the only exception to that. I did that twice. I released the campaign when it was halfway done, and the first time was definitely, I would argue it was a mistake from a qualitative standpoint, but the second time was more like, this is a kind of an experimental tech demo shit in terms of projects. So I'm looking for feedback on that, and I also want to see, like, even if it's not like, I'm just gauging based on reactions, not necessarily them coming to me and telling me their thoughts or whether or not I even buy into their thoughts, but it's more like how did these people even react to this sort of thing? So that's that has happened for me twice, but the same sort of mechanism did happen where while I was still motivated and still determined to finish it, I definitely felt that like, maybe it was a different mechanism, but for me it was like an allure of like, why don't I just, spend a lot of time editing the maps that are already out and refining those, even though I still have more to make, and like get bogged down in the process. Like, what it would be so great to just like constantly mine feedback for these particular things and get stuck on those instead of continuing to produce stuff, which is why I do think for the most part that's a shoddy way to handle it.
I saw it work for Dwarven Combat because the guy was doing it for $10,000. So the feedback was just a means to an. I'm not sure if the feedback even really did that much, because he based a lot of that actually on my feedback because I was helping him test it internally. And but there was a larger test with some people that he knew, I guess. But at that point, like most of the game systems had already been largely solidified. I think you may have changed some of the scoring or something like that, but it was fairly minor compared to the stuff he was changing when I was testing. It's like the control systems and stuff like that needed a lot of work because it was over BattleNet 0.2 and it was very, very slow. Very, 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 very slow. Don't make maps for StarCraft 2, especially if you want them to be any more responsive than PowerPoint, because Blizzard says, no, you can't do that. Sorry. It's crazy, the latency. But most of the stuff I've seen that release beta tests, they burn out very quickly. Because, for one, the vast majority of people who you may have had orbiting your development are no longer going to be orbiting it nearly as closely because now they've seen it. And now their first impressions have been colored by something that is not finished at the best. At the best. At the worst, it's going to be problematic and a piece of shit, which is generally what happens. So now you actually lose a lot of steam just out of that alone. If you were a person who was really feeding off of that orbiting momentum, you're going to lose that very quickly. And then you're going to not really feel as motivated to work on it as much because now the initial high that you've been waiting for is now gone. And any consecutive or final release is going to have less and less and less focus. And that's not really good. Like, I made this mistake with Armageddon Onslaught, actually. I had a couple of, I think, internal-ish testing with some people from Maplantis, and that I forget why I did them, to be honest. I don't really remember why, because it was over 10 years ago now, but it was not good. It was definitely disruptive. I think it may have been for balancing purposes, but the thing is the AI was helping me with that already. I think it may have been as a result of those games that I decided to really focus more on the non-converted AI and buff them up, so I didn't have to do that anymore. And then as a result, the final product was released, and I've heard more about that in the last year than I have in the 8 years prior to that. So, not that it really bothered me a lot because it's a tech demo and it's unstable and stuff like that. So it's, I don't really expect too much out of it. But there are still wikis and stuff like that that try hotlink to the files on my site, so I do change the URL. And it always surprises me to find that, because it's like, I don't think these are bots setting them up. These are, for some reason, people hotlinking to my website that are actually even aware the project even exists on my fucking website, and that surprises the ever-living shit out of me. But
well, it's sort of similar to when people ask me about what the future of characters are in my stories or my campaigns are. They're waiting for the sequel, and it's similar sort of surreal nature to the experience that you get out of that. I think, for me, it's like you really give a shit. I mean, I guess it's a marker of your success, but in terms of how efficient the concepts were, people found it compelling. Even if you yourself don't, can only see flaws, because that is something that is the case for In Consummate. I've talked to death that I don't think it's a great project, even if it's relative to its peers. It's well above the rank and file, just because it has things that you would think would be in every project or should be in every project, like voice acting and custom AI and a bunch of other stuff, custom tiles and stuff. But even despite that, just based on the admittedly flawed production value alone, it stands above everybody else. That doesn't really, it's clearly not enough for me, because I'm going in directions that allow me to do way more than I ever thought possible back then. That's where I'm going now. So I think you can, it's sort of like what you were doing with, I think, your evolution of Armageddon Onslaught, where you're going to a completely new engine so you can actually realize some of the concepts that you couldn't realize in Brood War. If I have any... I feel like that's probably the biggest motivation to do something like that anyway, would be to, you still have the idea for this project that you think is worthwhile. And so, of course, in your own head, you've imagined the solution to all of the problems that you saw. You've already leveled up the concept for across so many years of work, and on a conceptual level, but also in an implementation, technically implementing this stuff. You've already done all that. And then along comes somebody who's like, remember Armageddon Onslaught? I love that. And you're like, what? Because in your head, you've already departed the idea that was a worthy investment of anybody's time, because all you can see is your own flaws or whatever.
No, I think you've got to go. I think you said 7 was your limit. But
I can stick around for a little bit if we want to wrap things up.
Okay. I was gonna actually say that there's so much more to talk about that I don't know how much more I really should get into, but it's definitely bizarre, the things that have been going on. Like, I don't know really how to even put in words, because I came to hate modding really for a lot of reasons. But now, because of my video casting, I've been exposed to more people doing modding than I ever have been as a modder. Because it was actually because of YouTube. A lot of these people found me on YouTube who didn't post stuff publicly and don't want to post stuff publicly. And, you know, they'd be like, wow, there's people out there who actually have standards and stuff like that, and yada, yada, yada. Nobody else does mods, yada, yada, yada. And then they would show me stuff and I'd give them feedback. And then I don't think a lot of these people will probably end up ever actually finishing their projects. But there's like total conversions with all new graphics and stuff like that, like at a level easily comparable to the originals. And, you know, things like sort of in between and stuff like that. People making custom AI and stuff like that. And for some reason, these people gravitated towards me just because of the shitty StarCraft 2 casts I made that I ended up getting rid of because they were terrible. And I ended up just abandoning the platform because it was terrible. And these people ended up just following me anyways. I mean, there was also a share of creepy people like Chris and Mark and Felshin who kind of just like crawled out of the WordWorks and started defecating all over everything and necromancing 11-year-old threads. But like, what the fuck is wrong with that guy?
Oh, Mark?
But no, Chris.
Oh,
Mark was weird too.
I don't even know which Chris you could be talking about.
The one who's just necroing posts on CC as if anybody gives a fuck about anything he has to say.
I haven't been to that site in forever. Let me take a look.
He is like necromancing random people's campaign threads just to like yell at them about shit. It's funny.
Oh,
kind of sad.
Yeah, this guy's he's on my stream all the time talking to me about shit. Yeah, I said something to the effect of the only people who are on campaign creations now are Razorclaw X and his band of furries. And Chris made sure to correct me and say, I'm also there. So thanks. Thanks for chiming in.
Yeah, he's sure there. He's definitely leaving his mark. He's polishing those ancient crusty turds.
Yeah, is it any surprise?
He got very mad about a 3 or 4 year old post about Trump and started having a spurg out, and then he mentioned something about going to Reddit, and then he ended up trying to quote or use a reference to a guy who is known for buying nipple clamps or something. Like,
well,
it was depressing. I guess this guy's just into some wacky shit. But
hey man,
you'll definitely have a fun time reading that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I got some light reading.
I'm fine with closing up here because there's probably I need to like kind of like collect my thoughts on a lot of stuff because I know I had more stuff to say, but I'm kind of
if you want to do a part 2 next week or whenever we're both available, we can just go right back onto this topic because I think I do agree as well. There is a lot of stuff to continue to deconstruct about this, and like I said earlier, it's useful for me because I feel like anytime I find some way to better to describe or disseminate my thoughts on a certain matter, it just winds up being. It's basically what I do is when I'm doing these mod streams, especially if nobody's in the chat in particular feeling talkative. I know I get a lot of people who just sit there and watch and listen as opposed to actively communicating in chat, which is totally fine. So a lot of the times I'll be left to my own devices to come up with some topic, and I try to come up with some way to verbalize what I'm doing. Basically what you do in your game, your educational series where you're recording Unreal and you're like talking about what you're doing, keeping things engaging. I'm basically doing the same thing, but I do, especially lately, because it's been coming up in the server and in the podcasts and in the dad cause, I dip into the philosophical and I talk about, you know, how one might improve their work ethic and their scheduling and their discipline and all this other stuff that we've been talking about in this podcast. And I definitely think that it's more of a conversational thing because we are both trying to get to the bottom of it. We don't really have the answers prepped and ready to go. And that's one of the reasons why these podcasts exist. So I definitely think it's worthwhile, and I think that any way that I can improve again, going back to something I made a comment on earlier, I'm sharpening a tool set that I haven't really used that often, which is fully understanding a concept through verbalization, through speaking it into existence. I'm able to understand whatever it is that brought me to success, or whatever concept I agree with or disagree with in any context. And being able to do that is, I would say, really important if you really want to understand. And you have to understand whatever it is. In this case, we're talking about discipline, or sticking to a schedule, or being productive, or being motivated. If you really want to understand that, you need to be able to verbalize it enough to explain it to somebody else, and your thoughts on it, and your struggles and your strengths. And once you understand it, that's when you can, I think, really make some concerted effort to have a meaningful amount of progress and change in whatever you're dissatisfied with. And so, obviously, kind of a nebulous way to close out, but I think that's one way to do it. So I'm sure we'll continue talking about this on the server and in other places, and eventually we'll get back onto a podcast sometime next week and do it all over again.
Mm-hmm. I just hope the ice doesn't take my power.
Exactly.
If I was living in the old place still, the power would already be out. I'm sure they have no power right now because there's winds of like 20 kilometers. That's enough to knock down those power lines.
Well, pray for Mesk to get some rain instead of hail.
We actually haven't gotten hail for a long time. What we are going to get is just straight up ice. It's actually going to be like -8 during the day. That is unheard of here.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Is there are you actually excited to have cold temperature? Because usually you're complaining about the heat.
I am actually excited. I'm not fond of the possibility of our fucking water rupturing, but
yeah, you got to make sure to always have the tap on for a while or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I covered up everything and did some bushwhacking and covered up the hose in newspaper and plastic just to hope. But I can't actually unattach the hose because it's joined and rusted onto the faucet. And
no, I think if you turn the tap on just enough to have a dribble, I don't know if you can even afford to do that, but if you just do that with cold water only, that will that stops the pipes from freezing. That's what I've been told anyway. You can feel free to DuckDuckGo that one.
But side thing is, it's on the other side of the house. I don't know how really useful it'd be, but I actually was looking to see if I can turn off the water for just that, and it seemed like I read a lot of articles. Most of them are useless, and basically, you're supposed to be able to find some valves near. Inside the house near that one that's outside that you can pull things and then drain water out of. Those don't exist in this house. And there's only one little pipe that I think connects to both fucking outdoor bibs, I think they're called. And I can't drain water out of it with that at all. There is no drain for it. So I'm fucking high and low. So I'm just gonna hope that nothing explodes. But yeah, I'm actually gonna like the cold because I prefer the cold. Honestly, 5 is a little too warm, and but negative. It was saying we were gonna get -23. I was really excited, but now it's saying -13, and now I'm half expecting there to be no wind at all. So, because our weather is always so inaccurate. Before 5 hours, it said you're gonna get rain, and then we got snow. And then it said, you're going to get snow, and then we got rain all day long, and it was very hot. So, yeah, Canada's weather is just fucked.
Apparently, your weather prediction systems are also fucked. Do you guys still have that problem with your internet, by the way, where there's a bad receiver or something? I forget what the actual hardware is.
Oh, yeah.
It's servicing a quarter of the fucking country, and it's busted or something.
Yep. And the one on the nose just kept setting on fire. I still get a lot of dropouts. It hasn't been as much of an issue earlier in the year, but later in the year, it was an issue for sure.
Reasonable. Well, I think that will do it for us. Hopefully you don't get iced out of existence, and we'll be back with any luck next week to talk more about this. I think it was a good one. I hope you guys enjoyed, and big kisses for big men.
Big men.